Now that you all have learned about the tissues, now we can start to understand and learn how tissues come together to form organs, and then organs come together to form organ systems, and how those organ systems of the human body help work together to carry out homeostasis, how they work individually but also together in the human body. And the first organ system that we get to talk about is the integumentary system. And the integumentary system is going to be made up of the skin as well as the accessory structures that we find within the skin. So the skin, which makes up the most of the integumentary system, the skin alone accounts for about 10 to 15% of total body weight. So it's the largest organ in the human body, and it's the one of the most superficial ones. If you look down at your body, the first thing you see is the epidermis of your skin. So it wraps around the entire human body, and it's essentially the primary barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. Now, skin, we can call that, remember we talked about membranes in the last chapter, the skin can also be called the cutaneous membrane. Remember, membranes are layers of tissue that provide some sort of boundary or barrier, a lining or a partition. We talked about 4 different types of membranes found throughout the human body in the last chapter. We talked about serous membranes, synovial membranes, mucous membranes, and then the cutaneous membrane, which is also called the skin. And the cutaneous membrane is specifically 2 layers. The epidermis, which is the most superficial layer, it's one that you see when you look at your skin, you see the epidermis. Epi meaning above the dermis. So it's superficial to the dermis, which lies below. And that epidermis is made up of that stratified squamous epithelium, so lots of layers of squished squamous cells. Remember, stratified squamous epitheliums, anywhere, it's going to be located anywhere that's open to the outside and subject to abrasion, so that we can have layers of cells that can slough off. We have more layers below that, and then we can regenerate more. And so they get sloughed off towards the apical surface, and then more can generate over time. So that's the epidermis. The dermis, which is just deep to the epidermis, is going to be made up of connective tissue. Remember, epithelial tissues, any type of epithelium is going to have connective tissue below it to help anchor it and provide blood vessels, etc. And so the dermis, just deep to the epidermis. Now, last chapter, I mainly talked about the dense, irregular connective tissue of the dermis. That's the bulk of the dermis. There is, you will see later when we specifically talk about the dermis, that there's a thin layer of loose connective tissue, which is just below, like if we have stratified squamous epithelium, the basement membrane of the stratified squamous epithelium, immediately below that is a layer called the papillary layer, and that's made up of loose connective tissue, and then below that would be the reticular layer of the dermis, and that's the thickest layer of the dermis, and that's where we find the dense, irregular connective tissue. So I was a little more general in the last chapter, and now I can get more specific with the structure of these layers. Okay, and I'll talk more about that later on in the chapter. So that's the cutaneous membrane, the epidermis and the dermis. That is specifically our skin. The accessory structures, which as we go along in the chapter, we'll talk about their specific structure and functions, where they're located, their structure and their function. Accessory structures are sweat glands, sebaceous glands, hair, nails, sensory receptors. So we'll find nervous tissue also embedded throughout the skin, and we'll even see little bands of smooth muscle called erector pili muscles. We'll talk about these later on as well. These are all accessory structures, and together these, along with the skin, make up the integumentary system. Now remember, the epidermis, which is stratified squamous epithelium, all epithelial types are going to be avascular. Remember, epithelium, the purpose is to provide a barrier or a lining. These cells are joined by tight junctions, and so they're cells tightly packed together. If they had blood vessels running through them, it would make for a really sad barrier, right? It would interrupt the barrier, and it wouldn't be very very good at providing a barrier if it was interrupted by blood vessels. So the epidermis is avascular, it does not have blood vessels, and it's going to rely solely on diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the blood vessels that are found in the dermis. So remember, the dermis, we have a loose connective tissue layer, which is a thin layer directly below the epidermis. Remember when we talked about loose connective tissue, it is vascularized. So blood vessels will be found there, as well as the dense irregular connective tissue. Although these collagen fibers of the dense irregular are densely packed together, the irregular nature of them provides room for blood vessels to go through that as well. So these connective tissues are vascularized. They'll have blood vessels in them. And so diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from the blood vessels in the dermis that diffusion will go up, follow its gradient, and diffuse upwards to the epidermis above. And so that's how the cells of the epidermis get oxygen and nutrients. It's through diffusion from the blood vessels in the dermis. It says about 50%, so about half of epidermal cells are too far from the adequate blood supply to sustain life. So as those epidermal cells move from the basement membrane up towards the apical surface, they are getting further away from the blood supply, right, of the dermis. And the further away they get from the blood supply, the more likely that diffusion will not happen that far away, right? So only the cells closest to the dermis are going to be getting adequate oxygen and nutrients to undergo normal metabolic function. So as they reach the apical surface, we'll talk about a few reasons why, but one of the major reasons why they die and they slough off is because they no longer are getting enough nutrients from the blood vessels in the dermis. Okay, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the life cycle of epidermal cells. And so this is a nice cartoon picture of the cutaneous membrane, which is the epidermis. Up here, stratified squamous epithelium. Here's that apical surface. The dermis, which lies below that, just deep to that. If you see here, we'll notice the epidermis is very highly invaginated. It's not just straight across, right? We see these dermal papillae that kind of project up into the epidermis. These folds of the epidermis, but these folds between the epidermis and the dermis, provide more surface area. More surface area means more diffusion of nutrients from the blood vessels that will be located here in the dermis up to the epidermal cells, all right? And we'll talk more about that later. This, if we were to draw an imaginary dotted line across like the tips of the little bottom dips of the epidermis, all of this dermis that's shoved up into here, these are called dermal papillae. This would be the loose connective tissue, and then from here to where the hypodermis begins, and we say adipose, this would all be dense irregular connective tissue. And the bulk of the accessory structures of the integumentary system are embedded within the dermis. Okay, so the bulk of those accessory structures, we see hair follicles, sebaceous glands, sweat glands, all apocrine sweat glands, some nervous tissue structures. We'll talk about all these in detail as we go along in the chapter, but most of them are going to be embedded within the dermis of that cutaneous membrane of the skin. And then the hypodermis, so hypo meaning below the dermis, is not considered technically a part of the skin. It's a layer of loose connective tissue as well as adipose, and the bulk of what we see here is adipose. A lot of times in cartoon images, adipose will look somewhat yellowish. The hypodermis is a connective tissue layer of loose connective tissue and adipose that will anchor the cutaneous membrane to the muscle or bone below. All right, and the hypodermis is very highly vascularized. That's why a lot of times you'll have certain injections will be in the hypodermis with a hypodermic needle, right? It's because it's a good way to administer drugs or whatever it is that you're trying to administer into the bloodstream, because the hypodermis is very highly vascularized. Oh, so here, hypodermis. Some other terms that you might hear the hypodermis be referred to as is superficial fascia. So fascia refers to connective tissue that kind of anchors organs together. It's a loose-ish connective tissue that helps just kind of hold organs together and anchor them to one another. So the hypodermis can also be called the superficial fascia, or you can call it the subcutaneous fat. Sub meaning below, cutaneous meaning the cutaneous membrane. So the fat, because a lot of the tissue that we find in the hypodermis is adipose, subcutaneous fat, that's what that means. All right, so not a part of the skin, rather it anchors the skin to the deeper structures like muscle or bone that would be found below that. Made up of loose connective tissue as well as adipose, and again has abundant blood supply, and that's why a lot of times you'll have hypodermic injections, because it's a good way to administer drugs to the bloodstream directly. All right, so let's talk about some overall functions of the integumentary system. The most obvious function of the integumentary system is protection from mechanical trauma, pathogens, as well as environmental damage. And so that remember the stratified squamous epithelium, especially if it's keratinized. If it's keratinized, it has, as in thick skin, has that big, thick, dead layer of cells right on the apical surface. So it really provides a mechanical barrier for protection. So we have lots of layers of cells of the epidermis. That means that some can be sloughed off due to mechanical trauma, abrasion, friction, rubbing, scratching, things like that, stretching, some pressure, abrasions. So it allows for some of those cells to be able to be sloughed off, but then we still have cells remaining behind. And then the cells nearest the basement membrane, nearest the blood supply of the dermis, they are very mitotically active, and they will undergo mitosis quite frequently and produce more epidermal cells, so that as they slough off or become damaged or die, then more is constantly being made. All right? So it provides a durable, because of all of those layers, but yet somewhat flexible surface. We know that our skin is pretty flexible and that it provides protection. Provides continuous barrier. So not only is having multiple layers of the epidermis good for protection against mechanical trauma, it's also a good barrier between microorganisms or pathogens that we don't want to get inside. So now we have good bacteria, and then we have bad bacteria or pathogens. And those pathogens, having lots of layers of the epidermis, means that these pathogens have to get through lots of layers of cells before they can get into the bloodstream and potentially cause infection. So having those lots and lots of layers of stratified squamous epithelium also provides a good barrier against invasion by microorganisms, unwanted microorganisms. And there are also, we'll talk about a cell type in the epidermis called Langerhans cells, and they're actually they can phagocytize unwanted pathogens, hopefully before they enter deeper into the tissue, into the deeper tissues. And contains cells of the immune system that destroy pathogens. Those are those Langerhans cells that I just mentioned, and I'll show you that later on. Protection continued. Glands, so we'll talk about some sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands produce a sebum, which is a lubricating type substance, and it helps lubricate and moisten the skin. We know that if our skin is not lubricated or moistened, then it cracks, and if it cracks, that provides an entrance for unwanted microorganisms. So that's a way that it is protective, but these glands secrete a substance that helps lubricate and moisten the skin. And in that sebum, we'll also have antimicrobial substances that can help combat pathogens before they can get through the cells. And then it also, that sebum has a slightly acidic pH, and that slightly acidic pH provides an unfavorable environment for pathogens to enter. So that's a way that these accessory structures help aid in protection. Provides protection from environmental hazards. So ultraviolet light, we know UV light can damage DNA, and that is bad. And so there are cells in the epidermis called melanocytes that produce a pigment called melanin. Melanin can absorb UV radiation and protect our tissues, right? So that's a way that the integumentary system provides protection against environmental damage, UV radiation. Secretes hydrophobic lipid-based chemicals. So the skin produces this hydrophobic lipid-based chemical that kind of lines the skin, and it repels ionic compounds as well as polar covalent like water molecules, and it keeps them from both. So think of it, the skin produces a hydrophobic barrier. It essentially makes us water repellent. And that's good because it keeps water or ionic compounds from getting into or out of our body. So it provides it's really important in maintaining water and electrolyte balance. It keeps water and moisture from leaving our body, or water and moisture from the external environment getting into our body. All right, so it's our own weatherproofing, right? So our skin has the ability it weatherproofs itself. All right, but because the surface of the skin is layered with a hydrophobic lipid-based chemicals, it's good for repelling water, but any substances that are hydrophobic can very easily get through the skin, because remember, if we're talking about hydrophobic molecules can be dissolved in other hydrophobic substances, whereas water-soluble or hydrophilic substances can be dissolved in hydrophilic-like substances as well. So like dissolves like, okay? So anything that is hydrophobic could very easily get through the skin. That's why if you've ever heard of birth control patches, how is it that a patch on the skin can provide hormones? How can that get through? It's because hormones in those birth control patches are hydrophobic. Those particular hormones are hydrophobic, and so they can very easily get through this hydrophobic barrier because like dissolves like, if that makes sense. Or if we're talking about chemicals, for example, if you're working in a lab and you're dealing with methanol is hydrophobic, and you definitely want to wear skin protection like gloves if you're dealing with methanol, because methanol very easily gets absorbed through the skin. Because methanol is hydrophobic, it can get through that hydrophobic barrier that the skin produces. Sensation, we'll talk about the different types of nervous tissue structures that we'll find in the integumentary system, but the skin plays a vital role in being able to sense especially external, but internal stimuli as well. So being able to sense extreme temperature, hot, cold, pain, pressure, touch receptors, those types of receptors are all found in the skin, and we'll talk about that later. So playing a role in sensation. And then thermoregulation, the skin plays a role in, so thermoregulation is the body's ability to maintain a stable internal body temperature via negative feedback loops, all right? So if we were to, and you can read through what I'm about to talk about is just typed up in these slides, but here, so we have a normal range of body temperature, and if that body temperature were to increase above our normal range, right? So that's the stimulus, is an increase in body temperature. This could be due to exercising. Exercising increases the core body temperature, or if we had a bacterial or viral infection and we were running a fever, right? All of that, if we were in a really hot environment, right, in middle of the summer in South Louisiana, our internal body temperature increases. Well, that's the stimulus. That is going to be received by receptors in the brain. There are receptors in the brain that can pick up on the temperature of the internal body fluids, all right? And then that information, so that stimulus would be an increase in body temperature. It's received by thermoreceptors in the brain. That information is then sent to a control center called the hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus is a critical thermostat for our body. That hypothalamus is going to determine that our body temperature is above our normal range, and then it's going to send out information to the appropriate effectors to carry out the response. And in this case, the effectors would be sweat glands as well as blood vessels that are found in the dermis. So what it's going to do is the hypothalamus will tell the sweat glands to produce sweat. So sweat gets released or secreted to the skin. Then that sweat, which is going to be primarily water, will evaporate. And when water evaporates, it draws heat away from the skin. So this is a way of cooling off the body through evaporative cooling. Sweat gets released, that water evaporates, and when it evaporates away from the skin, it draws heat away from the skin with it. Now, the other effector would be the blood vessels of the dermis, and the response is to dilate these blood vessels. So dilation of the blood vessels means that the diameter gets larger, a wider diameter. They get wider, meaning more blood will pool in these blood vessels, and these blood vessels will also, as they dilate, they get closer to the surface of the skin, and that allows for heat in the blood to radiate off and cool the body that way. Okay, so this is a way of using radiation to cool. All right, so these blood vessels dilate, more blood pools near the surface of the skin. That's why a lot of times if you have a fever or if you're exercising, you may appear very red. It's because your blood vessels in your skin are dilating. But it allows for the heat to radiate from the blood off and cool your body that way. These responses carried out by these effectors will lower the body temperature back to our normal range. Okay? Now, what happens if the opposite occurs? So we have our normal body temperature, but it drops below the normal range. That's the stimulus. So we're in a really, really cold environment. All right? So it's the environmental temperature drops, and that's going to cause the temperature in our skin to drop first. So a lot of times if we're talking about dropping below our normal body temperature range, it's the receptors in the skin that will detect it first before the thermoreceptors in our brain detect it, because our skin will cool off first before before the internal environment does. So thermoreceptors that are embedded in the skin will pick up on that decrease in body temperature. That information gets sent to, so those would be the receptors that sense the stimulus. That information gets sent to the control center, which is the hypothalamus again. The hypothalamus is the thermostat in our brain. All right. This is going to detect that our body temperature is dropping below a normal range. Then it will send out the appropriate information to the effectors to carry out a response. And the effector here would be our blood vessels, but instead of vasodilation, what's going to happen is the response now will be vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction means these blood vessels will constrict, the diameter gets smaller, and it will conserve, so less blood will come to the skin, and think of it, it redirects. So it minimizes the amount of heat that will get lost through radiation, right? Because here we're losing heat through radiation, Well, if our body temperature is getting colder, then we don't want to radiate heat off of our body. We want to conserve that heat, especially for our internal vital organs. So we have vasoconstriction, which minimizes the radiation of heat. It also redirects blood to our internal vital organs so that those can maintain body temperature. That's why a lot of times you might appear very pale when you're super cold. It's because blood is being redirected to the internal vital organs, less of it towards the skin. Another response that's not shown in this diagram, but in extreme cold, then what would happen is the hypothalamus would also send out information to skeletal muscles as an effector. So the skeletal muscles would start to involuntarily contract. That contraction generates heat, which can help maintain body temperature. So that's another effector and response that could happen as well. Those combined, so vasoconstriction, skeletal muscle contraction, this would increase body temperature back to our normal range. And that's all stated in the book as well as in these PowerPoint slides if you want to read that. So heat production and loss, the majority of heat production in the human body will be due to cellular metabolism. So cells all throughout our body and all of our tissues are undergoing metabolism. They're undergoing lots of metabolic reactions, and those reactions produce heat because energy transfer is never 100%. A lot of energy transfer gets lost as heat. That heat gets absorbed by our blood and then transported around the body to help maintain body temperature. The most active body cells and the major heat producers in the human body, skeletal muscle, right? Skeletal muscles are always contracting. Even if you're not up walking around or running, if you are maintaining posture, you have skeletal muscles that are contracting. Cardiac muscle, your heart pumps all day long, all day, every day. And so cardiac muscle, because it's constantly contracting, it's also generating heat. The cells of the liver is an extremely metabolically active organ, and so it produces a lot. It's very large as well, so it produces a lot of heat. All of that heat, right, because these are they're utilizing ATP energy. They're cleaving those bonds in ATP, and when they cleave those bonds, not only are they releasing energy that can drive metabolic reactions, it's also releasing energy in the form of heat. That heat gets absorbed by your blood and then transported around the body to maintain body temperature. So that's the major way of the body produces heat. It's through these tissues, okay? How does the human body lose heat? So the primary methods of heat loss, the major one being that radiation. So just the fact that heat gets lost, there's a gradient, especially if your external environment is slightly cooler than body temperature, then you can lose heat through radiation, right? Just heat radiates off of our body. Conduction just means that heat moves from our skin to cooler objects. You all have experienced this. If you've sat in a chair for a long period of time, then you stand up and you touch the chair and that chair is pretty hot. It's because heat from our body was conducted to that chair. The chair started off as a cooler object and heat was conducted from our body to that chair, if that makes sense. Convection is a form of heat loss, and that's due to circulating air currents. Essentially, so the layer of air molecules that are closest to our body, those air molecules will heat up. We all know hot air rises, right? So that layer of hot air right next to our skin will rise. It will move away from our body to cooler air, and it gets replaced by cooler air. And then that cooler air will warm up because it's right next to our body. It will rise and it gets replaced by cooler air. And so that circulating air current is called convection, right? So the layer of air right next to our skin heats up, rises, and then a new layer of air heats up, rises, and it circulates that way. And then evaporation, we talked about that with the sweat glands. So sweat glands release a watery substance called sweat. it evaporates, and when it evaporates away from our body, it pulls hot air with it. So that's evaporative cooling. And then another function of the integumentary system is excretion. And the integumentary, when we think of excretion, really we think about the kidneys as the kidneys play a major role in excreting like toxins and wastes, things that we don't want in our body, the elimination of waste. Really that role is played out by the kidneys, but the skin does play a role. It contributes in excretion of waste products as well, and that would be through the sweat. All right, so our sweat glands can also release unwanted toxins or waste products as well. So the integumentary system does play a role in excretion or elimination of wastes, although the kidneys are the major contributor to excretion and elimination of wastes. The skin plays a critical role in vitamin D synthesis. So something that you may not know is that cells of the epidermis produce a precursor molecule to vitamin D, but it's completely inactive. It's inactive. It doesn't play the role that it needs to. It's just a precursor. It's actually based off of cholesterol. So remember when we talked about cholesterol is a type of lipid. It has those 4 big ring structures that make up cholesterol. This is another reason why cholesterol is important in your diet. Too much cholesterol, maybe not a good thing, but some cholesterol, you don't want to completely eliminate cholesterol. So cholesterol is used in vitamin D synthesis. Well, your skin cells, your epidermal cells, make an inactive version of vitamin D. And when that inactive vitamin D precursor molecule is exposed to UV radiation, it gets converted into another compound. That compound then will be released into the blood, gets further modified by the liver and then the kidneys to become an active form of vitamin D. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the names of the precursor molecules. I just want you to understand that epidermal cells synthesize a precursor to vitamin D. And after it gets exposed to UV radiation, then it can circulate and be further circulate in the blood and be further modified by the liver and the kidneys into an active form of vitamin D. Why does our body need vitamin D? Why is it important that our skin cells produce this precursor molecule and that it gets exposed to UV radiation? Vitamin D is critical for calcium absorption in the intestines. You cannot absorb calcium unless you have vitamin D. So if you are not getting enough sun exposure, right, just enough sun exposure to help with vitamin D synthesis, then you need to be taking in vitamin D foods that are fortified with vitamin D, right? You can get milk that's fortified with vitamin D. That's because vitamin D is absolutely vital for calcium absorption. You can take in calcium all day long, but if you don't also have vitamin D present, you won't be able to absorb that calcium in the small intestine. All right. Why is calcium so important? Why do we need to absorb that in our diet? It's because calcium is super critical for nervous tissue function, muscle contraction, and also maintaining bone tissue structure. And we'll talk about calcium throughout. You'll hear calcium throughout Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2. Calcium is very, very important. And so you either need to get some sun exposure for vitamin D synthesis, or you need to eat foods that are fortified with vitamin D to be able to absorb that calcium. So the skin plays a role in vitamin D synthesis and therefore calcium homeostasis.